to start off, we'll let you know a little bit about it.
Welcome to RetroWare TV.
Rad Racer is one of those iconic first-run NES games with the simple but memorable box art style that was prevalent in the early NES days. It's often mistaken as an NES launch title because of this classic look, and most people think that it's a Nintendo first-party game since it looks identical to their others like Metroid and Kid Icarus. But Rad Racer actually came out about 2 years after the NES's initial launch in the US. But if Rad Racer wasn't made by Nintendo, then who made it? Probably the last people you'd expect. The game was actually made by Squaresoft, the company behind all those RPGs you kids love. Not only that, but this game was made by two of Square's most recognizable faces, Hironobu Sakaguchi and Noobu Uematsu. Both took what would become their normal roles in making this game. Sakaguchi directed the game, and Uematsu made the music. They both went on to make Final Fantasy and a bunch of other games in the same capacity. Rad Racer pretty much lives up to its title in every way. It's a point-to-point racing game where you have a limited amount of time to make it to each checkpoint. If you don't make it in time, your car slowly rolls its way to a stop. Even if time has expired though, if you can manage to coast through the checkpoint, then you get to keep driving. It's an odd but surprisingly fun system. For the most part, I'd say I'm not that big a fan of racing games from the 8 and 16-bit era that take the behind-the-car approach. But Rad Racer seems to avoid a lot of the problems that more limited hardware can impose on these type of games. For example, in a lot of games of this type, it's hard to tell when you need to turn, so the turns just kinda sneak up on you. But in Rad Racer, there are street signs well in advance of the turn, and unlike other games of this type, the turning is not overly sensitive, so making them is really not that bad. In fact, the courses themselves are pretty easy once you get the hang of them, but there is one thing that adds to the difficulty. On the road, you'll encounter other drivers. Well, they're not so much drivers as moving roadblocks. The other drivers are not racing against you at all. In fact, they're just there to make the track more difficult for you. I would usually find this annoying, but the game pretty much always gives you a way to squeeze past them, and since they don't necessarily come in the same pattern every time, it adds an element of randomness to the game that makes it a lot more fun. So, with easy opponents and fairly simple tracks, what's to stop you from making it all the way to the finish line? Well, that's sort of the tricky part. While the enemies are fairly easy to dodge and the tracks are pretty simple, the combination of the two makes it so that once in a while, you'll press your luck and end up crashing. This wouldn't be a big deal, but the time restrictions for making it to the next checkpoint are pretty strict, and getting your car back on the road and up to full speed can take quite a while, so you can basically only crash once per checkpoint if you want to make it to the next one. This is a pretty good system, and it keeps you on your toes for sure, but it does have one flaw. If you crash late in the race, you don't have enough time to regain your speed, so you pretty much have no chance of making it to the next checkpoint. This can be super frustrating, and it's probably one of the game's biggest weaknesses. And speaking of weaknesses, there's one more thing I dislike about this game. It's the control layout. I'm not talking about how the car controls in the game, I'm talking about the actual buttons you use to control it. I know the NES had a very limited button layout, but this game is hand cramp inducing. Basically, A is gas, B is brake, and up is turbo. Doesn't sound like a bad setup, but in practice, it's a surefire way to get arthritis. If I had my way, it would have been A is gas, B is turbo, and either down or nothing at all is brake. See, you so seldom really need to brake hard that it's not really worth having it on the B button. Not only that, but anyone who has played Rad Racer can tell you that they almost always press down when turning the corners. But how could they know that, you might ask? Well, in this game, down turns on and changes the music. So oftentimes you'll be going around a turn and suddenly activate or change the music unintentionally. This is one of the strangest choices in the game, but I think it spawns from the select button already being taken, so they didn't have a good place to put it. And speaking of the select button, that button is reserved for one of the game's oddest features, 3D. That's right, Rad Racer supports 3D glasses. I wouldn't recommend that you play with them on for any long stretch of time, since then you'll have a hand cramp and a headache, but at the time it was a nifty little feature. I'd probably rather have the music on the select and forego the 3D capability, but whatever. And while we're talking about the music, I have to mention how awesome it is. There are really only like 3 songs in the whole game, but all 3 are very memorable and definitely stick in my mind as some of the best on the NES. At the time, Rad Racer was a pretty popular game. Almost all of my friends had it, and it was definitely one of those early titles that made the NES stand out. But 3 years later, Square released a sequel to Rad Racer, and it garnered much less attention. Rad Racer 2 is not a bad game by any means. In fact, in some ways it improves on the original, but it does have some problems, and it came out in 1990, which was only 1 year before the SNES launched, and a full year after the Genesis hit North America, so maybe people were getting their racing fix elsewhere at the time. In any event, Rad Racer 2 is an interesting but average game. First, the positives. The sort of gimmicky 3D mode has been removed, and the music is no longer controlled by pressing down on the D-pad. Graphically, the game is slightly better, but the real improvement is the scrolling. Everything just looks a lot smoother. Those things are all great, and I think they really made the game fun to play, but the problems outweigh the new additions. First off, the controls are identical to the previous game, so it's still uncomfortable to play for long stretches. Then we need to get into the sound. There are only 2 songs in the game. Each one of them is fine, but not nearly as good as the music from the previous game. That's disappointing, but I think Uematsu and company had moved well into Final Fantasy by this time, so it's not surprising. The biggest problem is that the music is not on by default. Instead, the game defaults to a sing it yourself mode. Sing it yourself? Why the hell would I want to do that? Well, it turns out that there's a damn good reason, because if you don't sing it yourself, then you don't get to hear about 90% of the sound effects. That's right, the game makes you choose. Do you want all the sounds with you singing along? Or would you rather have music and nearly no sound effects at all? To me, this is the biggest problem with the game. It makes it so that you never get to have that great moment where the music is really going and you're kicking everyone's ass. That's one of my favorite things in a racing game, and there is simply no way to have it here unless you want to tape the music onto a cassette or something and then play it back every time you start the race. This is poor programming, and even if it was a matter of being unable to do both, the new sound effects are not so amazing that it's worth the trade-off. In the end, Rad Racer 2 is very similar to the original, but with a few flaws that ultimately make it less enjoyable. It's still a pretty decent racing game on the NES, and graphically it may be one of the best looking, but I just couldn't get into it the same way I did with the first game. I believe Rad Racer 2 was a North American exclusive, so maybe Square knew it wouldn't be as popular either, but in any event, the Rad Racer series definitely left a mark on me as a kid. Back when Nintendo was all I could think about, Rad Racer was right there in the thick of it. The sequel may have been a bit disappointing, but who could hate a series that spawned the phrase,
I love the Power Glove. It's so bad.
Thanks for joining me on this trip down memory lane, and I hope to see you next time. Take care, everybody.